Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Danielson, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Saskatchewan Wheat Development Commission. I farm with my wife Sharon out in the Lacadina, Eston, Kyle area, sort of combination of towns out there. Lots of times when we go to these meetings, we hear discussions about the industry, and I think this meeting is one opportunity to discuss where the farmer fits or what the benefit is for producers in the industry. So I'm very happy to be, and our Wheat Commission is very happy to be part of this discussion, and we hope a serious debate comes out of it. Our next speaker is John Edsforth from Travacon Research. John is president of Travacon Research Limited. His post-secondary education was achieved at McGill University for his bachelor's degree, and his master's degree was earned at the California Institute of Technology. After university, John worked at Canadian Pacific in the research department, and at Boeing Company, he was group manager in the operations research unit. From a Canadian perspective, John has been contracted by rail shippers and government agencies to be a consultant. He was also an expert witness in Canadian regulatory hearings regarding new legislation and railway costing. We are pleased that John could come from Seattle to join us today, and welcome, John.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Dan, and thank you to the group for inviting me to make my presentation here today. This presentation follows up on some work that I did last winter in March for the group that you see on the slide here to estimate what are the contributions that the railways are making from handling the statutory grains in 2013-2014. I might say that this report follows up on similar work that I've done over the past 15 years since the current regime for rate making went into effect for the statutory grains. I've done them for various organizations over that time. So I've gone beyond what's in the report that I did to compare the results I got with results that I got from the earlier studies that I had done. So first of all, I want to say a few words about the nature of railway costs. See if I can make this thing work here. There we go. Okay, what I show here is that costs, in the sense that we use them for regulatory purposes, include operating expenses plus cost of capital. And just to elaborate a little bit on what we mean by cost of capital, it's the amount of cost that the railways incur in having their capital tied up in the assets that they use for transportation. So we're talking locomotives, freight cars, track, and sundry other ones. Cost of capital represents about 10% of total railway costs. And basically they are determined as being the amount that the railway needs to earn in order to be able to cover his debt interest, his corporate income taxes, and to return a satisfactory return on investment for the money he has tied up in the capital. Within that category of total costs, one of the subcategories is volume-related variable costs. And those represent about 80% of the totality of railway costs. And that also includes both operating expenses and cost of capital, but only on the items that are variable with the amount of traffic that you handle. So it's locomotives, it's freight cars. It's about 50% of the total that is invested in track. We then have a second category, which are called line-related costs. Line-related costs are not variable in the strictest sense. That is to say, if you handle more traffic or less traffic, they don't go up or down. They just are there because a railway line is there. And in the particular context of statutory grain, it refers to lines that are there because there is grain moving, and where in the absence of statutory grain, the line would not be there. And it's a fairly important category in terms of productivity gains that the railways have been getting in recent years. Then there's constant costs, which is the residual after you take out those first two categories. And constant costs are costs that do not go up or down when volume changes. The biggest single component of constant costs is about 50% of the cost of the track structure. In other words, as traffic goes down on a line to lower volumes, you do reduce your costs. That's the variable part. But you get to a point where you've got down to the minimum that you can operate with and still have a serviceable rail line. Those are called the constant costs. Go to the next chart. That's not the next chart. Excuse me. I need help.
Need a technician?
Seems to be a chart missing.
There he comes.
Okay, I'm looking for this chart. This one here. There it is. Okay, good, thank you. Now, a word on contribution, because that's the main thing that I'm measuring in this project. Contribution is what's left over after you subtract variable costs from revenues, and in the case of grain, also subtracting the line-related costs. You need contribution because you've got constant costs. And if you look at the railway in totality, you can figure contribution out for every individual component of the railway. And if the railway got just that amount of revenue to cover those variable costs, it would not have sufficient revenues to cover the constant costs. So you need the contributions to do that. It doesn't mean that every movement contributes the same contribution, and they vary all over the lot, as I will get to later. The system average, this was determined a couple of years ago by the Canadian Transportation Agency. The system average contribution to constant costs is 20.3% of variable cost. So that kind of tells you what the average is, and that's a point of comparison for just about anything else that you measure. If in aggregate the traffic earns enough in revenues to average 20.3% of variable costs, the railway will have adequate revenue to keep itself viable. Nothing further is required because costs include cost of capital, which basically is the profit the railway needs after, on an operating basis to stay in business. The Western Grain Transportation Act, which, as you all probably would know, was repealed in 1995. Over the period of operation of that act, the railways from statutory grain earned approximately 20% of variable costs by way of contribution, so above the system average to that extent. Now, it was designed to be 20%. That was what was in the legislation. But in the Western Grain Transportation Act, the railways were permitted to keep the monetary benefits that they get from productivity changes over a 4-year cycle before they would be taken away from them, which were by virtue of the 4-year costing reviews that took place under that act. So 27% became kind of a number that found its way into the lingo. And it found its way into the current legislation in the formulas that were established in the Act for the revenue cap. Those were designed to provide a contribution of averaging 27% of variable cost. As we'll get to shortly, the reality has been far different from that. Just looking at across all movements, and I've looked at a bunch of them over the years, and they're all over the lot. Some rates are like 3 times variable cost, so it's basically a 200% contribution. Some rates are below cost, and you've got just about everything in between. The main determinant of where you fit in that range depends upon the extent of your captivity. If you have a high degree of captivity, you normally would expect to get a fairly high contribution on your movement. The objective of the railways in marketing is to squeeze as much as they can out of each and every movement. And their marketing people are paid to know about the business of their clients and to understand from that the level of rates that they could tolerate, and thus the amount of contribution that they get. And so I have no doubt that that also applies with respect to grain, except that by virtue of the statutory grain provisions, there is a cap for now on how high they can go on those rates. And you'll see how that has gone over the years. I believe from work that I've done over the years that if there is effective competition, rail competition or competition from any other mode on a railway, that its contributions will not exceed 20% of variable cost. Okay, let me get to the results of the study that I did last spring. The railway revenues, let me get my little pointer going here. Railway revenues came to $1.2 billion, or $33.55 per ton. My estimate of the variable costs amount to $7.84, or $20 for the volume-related component. 30 million, or somewhat less than $1 per ton, for the line-related costs, totaling $814 million, 21 bucks. The contribution to constant costs is the $12.91 less the $814. I get down to $477 million, which is $12.39, and then that represents a 61% contribution as measured compared to variable cost. And what I call excess contribution, $322 million, or $836 per ton, and that represents the extent to which the contribution exceeds what I think would occur if there were effective competition for the traffic. So it's pretty robust. It's by no means the highest I've looked at over my career, but it's on the high side of what you would normally get. Now, as I said earlier, I have looked at a series of these over the years since the legislation was put in place. And these are the various ones that I've looked at, going back to the first year of the Act to the current years. And what you can, this measures the percent contribution on this axis against which crop year that represents. So as you can see, when the legislation first came in, the first year, 2020-01, the contribution was pretty modest. 17% was my estimate. And I think that probably pretty close. When I say my estimate, of course, I don't have the official costing data that the agency would have if it were to undertake the task. But I think in that case, they actually used my number because they didn't have the wherewithal to do it themselves right then. But I've made subsequent estimates over the years for various clients, largely the Canadian Wheat Board, but most recently, of course, for the group here today, and also Saskatchewan Highways and Transportation, which took a look at this way back. What you can see over the years is that it has grown. Like my most recent number, 61%, is up there. It's not the highest it's been, but it's well up. The trend is up, no question about that. So why is that the case? This chart, whoops, oh, did I screw up again? I need more help. Sorry about that. I should get you to give the presentation.
Yeah, I'll do the cooking.
That's the one. Thank you. So comparing the first year, 2020-01, with the most recent year, 2013-2014, the revenues per ton have increased by almost 30%, 29.8. And that has pretty much just followed the price index, which the agency calculates each year. There's a few other things that have contributed to it, but that is largely it. And the reason for that is that, of course, the index was designed to track price changes. What it doesn't give any effect to is productivity changes. So if the railway sees price increases of, say, 5% and productivity increases by 3%, to me, the logical thing would be to let the revenue go up by the difference, 5% minus 3%. Productivity does not come into that formula. It strictly is a price tracker. By my measurements over the same period, the volume-related variable costs have declined by 3.3%. The line-related variable costs have gone down by 24%. And as I'll get to, sorry guys. Thank you. Good, that's it. Last time I volunteered to work the tracker. The line-related costs have gone down by approximately 24%, and the reason why that's so substantial is the abandonment of grain-specific lines or the conversion of those lines to short line operations, which therefore are not included in the statutory movement. But the total variable cost per ton declined by 4%. So you look at the difference between the 29%, 30% increase, the 4% decline, and that's where the $8 a ton comes from. It's the productivity change is not taken into account. And by my calculation, at this number here, that represents a railway productivity improvement of about 33% from 2001 to 2013, 2014. That the railways have increased their productivity by that much, which is a pretty substantial rate of productivity change, and I'll get in a moment to sort of the outlook for that. But where have these productivity changes come from? I put them in two categories. One is grain-specific items. Others are general items that affect everything on the railway. The grain-specific ones, we have line abandonments and short lines. In 2001, by my count, there was about 6,100 miles of grain-dependent branch lines in the prairie provinces. My recent count that I did for the report I did last winter shows that has declined to 1,600. So it's gone down by a very substantial amount. And the CN and CP have saved a lot of the money, the line-related constant costs from those lines in that process. Related to that, but not entirely, is there's been a substantial reduction in the number of delivery points over that period. I don't have an accurate count of that, but I know that it's gone down by more than 50%. Some of that is delivery points on the grain-dependent lines that are no longer under railway operation. Some of it represents transfer of lines to short line operators who incur the cost of getting the cars loaded. Also, there has been a substantial implementation of incentive rates for unit train load lots and multiple car blocks at the larger loading points, and that has resulted in a substantial reduction in handling requirements. The general factors, one thing that has been big in the last 15 years has been the introduction of improved locomotives, high horsepower capacity locomotives that offer both reduced maintenance costs but also reduced fuel costs. Also, the railways have gone to operation of longer trains. That has been most pronounced in the lines to Vancouver, where CN and CP are co-producing, and they're able to operate that as if it was a double track, which allows them to run much larger trains and much more expeditiously. And finally, there have been substantial staff reductions on the railways, particularly in recent years at CP. Since Mr. Harrison came on the scene, he has certainly right-sized, or at least downsized, a lot of CP. So what is the outlook? I think probably in terms of the factors on this chart that the low-hanging fruit has been largely tapped. I would expect that there will be some deceleration in the rate of productivity gain, but there will still be productivity improvements. What can be done to improve the situation where virtually none of the productivity gains have flowed through to the users of the service, which is you guys, by virtue of dint of the fact that under the revenue cap formula, you don't get any credit for the productivity changes. Is that going to last? I didn't think it would last this long, quite frankly, when the new legislation came in 15 years ago. I felt that at some point before now, the railways would have reached the point where they were putting people out of business and thereby putting a constraint on themselves because they don't want to kill the golden goose. That has not happened yet. The railway revenues have pretty much followed the revenue cap. That can't happen forever. Sooner or later, people have got to figure out ways to use their land without having to depend so much on the railways, but it hasn't happened yet, and I wouldn't want to hazard a guess when and if it will. The other thing, I don't think that the powers that be in 2000 thought that the railways would get the contributions up this high. I know I was involved in that process, and certainly nobody that I was talking to was saying anything like that. They just felt, they didn't feel that there was that much there to get. I think that there are probably people in positions of influence who might want to do something about that.
We have 5 minutes?
5 minutes? Yeah. Very well. That was pretty much all I had to say anyway, so I think that's probably a good enough place to cut the presentation and respond to any questions from the group.
Okay, we have time for a couple or three questions. We'd ask you to ask only one question per person and try to limit the preamble a little bit. Go ahead.
Just one.
Just one. I just have one question for you.
Good for you.
Jeff Matheson, farmer and director on Sass Barley. You mentioned under the WGTA they had an average of 27% contribution to variable costs
That's correct.
for the railways.
That's what I was told, yes.
Now I've read a lot of this stuff and I may get it all mixed up, but WGTA was in place from the 70s through the 80s, is that correct? And during that time, were the railways not going bankrupt? If you could elaborate on that?
No, they weren't, and they were doing far better than they had prior to the WGTA coming in. The railways, through my career, I worked at CP from 1957 to 1968, and we were making miserable returns all through that period. Nowhere near enough to keep the railway viable in economic theory, but yet the railway continued to run. CN through that period was losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year, not even breaking even. So they still continue to operate. So there's a difference between economic theory and what actually happens. But the answer to your question is that WGTA was in effect from 1984 through 95. And the railways, by and large, were in pretty decent shape through that period.
Okay, I'd ask you also to state your name and where you come from.
James Gray from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. In the Western Producer in 1985, they had a little notation from CN Rail that the labor cost was 50 cents per metric ton for 2 men. What is it today?
That I don't know. Sorry.
Any other questions?
Jim? So the revenue cap from your
Name
data,
and...
sorry, James Nolan, University of Saskatchewan. From your data, the revenue cap's been pretty kind to the railways. Would you agree with that?
Is pretty...
Pretty kind to the railways? They've done very well under the revenue cap?
I
mean, they could have done better, but they did pretty well.
They do very well, I think.
Why do they want to get rid of it?
What? They wouldn't.
Why do they want to get rid of it?
Oh, they would like to just not have any constraints. They've got to sort of fuss every year to make sure they're not exceeding
Right.
it. And it's a bother to them, let's put it that way.
Here's a scenario. They look at the grain companies and go, gee, between 2013-14, they made X billions of dollars, and we couldn't get our hands on it because of the cap. Do you think that has anything to do with it?
Could be.
The change in the mindset?
That's a possible.
Well, thank you, John.
Just hope the review panel heard what I just said.
Thank you. And thank you to the man who saved my charts for me.
Always can use a technology.